Hello and welcome to episode number 7 of the Close Encounters podcast. First of all, let me send my apologies. This episode is a week late. Yes, I know, and I feel bad about it, but work unfortunately gets in the way, and we've got to do the boring stuff before we can do the fun stuff. I'm sure everyone knows what that's like, but we're getting closer to the conclusion of season 1. There's just 3 more episodes left after this episode before we take a short break. But in this episode, we will have our usual fixture of That's What I Call News. Then I will be talking to my guest this week, Floyd Wills, about his research into ancient giants. Then we will begin wrapping up episode number 7 with a look at the celestial events in the coming week. And this time, we'll be talking about our watch night that is coming up in April. A few details to release about that, because we forgot to do it last time. So without wasting any much more time, let us see what we've got coming up in the more interesting things in our segment with That's What I Call News. Yes, that's what I call news. It's my selection of the more interesting, weird and paranormal news from around the world. Let's see what we have for you this week. Astronomers have discovered a rare 1 in 10 billion star system destined to explode in a kilonova. This is coming from Futurism.com. A chance discovery by astronomers have led them to discover a star system that is set to explode in what is known as a kilonova in the distant future. Now, as spectacular as that may sound, a kilonova is less powerful than the better-known supernova, but what's got the attention of the astronomers this time is that they've discovered what they think, or what they believe, is the first of just 10 of these theorized binary star systems that should be present in our galaxy. The event, which is thought will happen in a couple of million years' time, a long way away, will be where 2 neutron stars collide and cause a kilonova, which is one of the ways the heavier elements in the universe is said to be formed. If I remember back to my physics classes in high school, maybe I wasn't wasted after all. So unless we can reincarnate or achieve immortality or transfer our memories or consciousness or whatever to another host, then this is something that none of us will ever get to see, unfortunately. But it is a shame, because I would imagine it would be a spectacular show indeed if we could get to see that. Moving over to Fox News Los Angeles, or foxla.com. A comet is set to pass Earth next year, dubbed the Comet of the Decade. According to Peter Ferries, an astronomer at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, the comet, called C2023-A3, bit of a mouthful, has the potential to be visible with the unaided eye in October of 2024, even from suburban areas. So C2023-A3 poses no threat to Earth, which will pass us at a comfortable distance of 43.5 miles, but looks set to put on a show. And according to the data already gathered on the comet, it is likely to be its first time in the solar system in about 4.5 billion years. So a very rare event indeed, and definitely something that I will be throwing into my calendar. But for those of us living in the British Isles, you can bet your lucky stars it'll be overcast that day and pouring it down throughout the whole month. So I would imagine that would be something that I would miss, but through no fault of my own, but down to Mother Nature, because that just seems to be the luck that we have here. Moving on to ScienceTimes.com, a spacecraft travelling 1/5 the speed of light could reach our nearest neighbour in 20 years. Now, we've all heard of the solar sail technique, and it's been doing the rounds again on the internet, but researchers at the Breakthrough Starshot Initiative are planning to send nanoprobes to Alpha Centauri, which is a star system about 4.4 light years away, to investigate and research an interstellar neighbour from close up, from afar. Sounds paradoxical indeed, but if you don't know what that means, they'll be sending probes to study it up close, but we'll be getting the data from a distance. That's what we mean by that. Now, with our current technological limitations, it would take centuries at best to reach our nearest neighbouring star system. But with the solar sail technique, it would take just 20 years to get there, and at least 4 years for that data to get sent back. So engineers are currently working to make this reality, where 3 Earth-based lasers would be used to propel a small payload with an attached solar sail, which would be about 3 meters in diameter and only a few microns thick. A fifth sounds like a small fraction when it comes to speed. I get that, but it puts into perspective how fast light does indeed travel across the vacuum of space. And hopefully, this will happen in my lifetime because it would be a monumental achievement to be able to witness this. Almost as monumental as setting foot on the moon, if we did. Moving on to popularmechanics.com. Time travel is possible with ring lasers, according to a Connecticut physics professor. So, Professor Ronald Mallet, a retired professor of the University of Connecticut, believes that time travel is possible with a project he's working on to do with spinning lasers. He theorizes that a spinning laser loop could potentially mimic the effects of a black hole and therefore bend space-time around it due to their theorized relation to each other, which is Einstein's theory of relativity. The only catch is that if it is successful, he could only go far back as 2019, when his machine was first switched on. Now, I guess that sounds a bit like a closed-circuit time machine, which, cool nonetheless. It's not quite sci-fi, where you can go to any era, but it's still a great concept nonetheless, and it doesn't say anything about how far ahead in time he could theoretically travel, but it's an endeavour I wish him all the best in, and I will be interested in learning more about this as and when it develops. And as always, links to each of the stories featured today can be found in our show notes on the podcast host and website. Now, let us go over and speak to Floyd Wills. Now, let us talk giants in this episode. Were they the product of imaginations of ancient civilizations for their tales and legends, or are these stories firmly rooted in elements of truth? This week's guest has spent years researching just that, which has taken him all over the world, no doubt, and afforded him the opportunity to engage with various different cultures. Floyd Wills, a holder of a Bachelor of Science degree, researcher and author from Vancouver in the United States, has compiled his research into a book called The Red-Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave and Other Ancient Mysteries. Now, I should imagine that the red hair detail will be a very important one during the interview. No doubt it'll crop up. Floyd is with me now with an 8-hour time difference. Good morning, Floyd.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good evening to you and your audience. And I just want to say thank you to you and your audience for having me aboard here. I look forward to our conversation.
I certainly do as well, because, again, like I was discussing with you before we started recording, it's not a strong point of mine when it comes to giants. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. But I guess when we think about giants, we sort of think of the biblical accounts and even fairy tales. But I understand your research indicates that this is further reaching than that, than just pure myth and story.
Yes, that's very true. There, I believe, is plenty of evidence, and I present that in my book, of actual archaeological discoveries of giants throughout the world. Primarily, my book focuses on those discoveries in North America. And particularly, I focus on an area in the state of Nevada, western part of the United States, of giants being discovered, skeletal remains and artifacts. Now, what's interesting, Chris, is I started to pour through a lot of these old newspaper accounts of giant discoveries. And in fact, I think there's over 1,500 current reports of these discoveries throughout North America. I came across a particular story that interested me because there was so much evidence as far as artifacts being found and some actual photographs of the remains of these giants, which is hard to come by in a lot of the other accounts of giants. And in the majority of newspaper articles that I uncovered about giant skeleton discoveries, is a lot of the bones just disappeared. And in some of those articles that even reference the Smithsonian Institution would come and take a look at the bones, and they disappeared.
I've heard of this before. Yes, they do. The Smithsonian Institute has a habit of making things that go against the mainstream understanding of archaeology and sciences, making it disappear.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And in fact, in my book, I talk about a little bit of the history of the Smithsonian Institution, which was founded in the mid 1800s. And James Smithson was an Englishman, and he actually left a bunch of money to the United States government to found the Smithsonian Institution. And the Smithsonian has uh, a huge amount of artifacts and remains. In fact, only a very small percentage of those are actually shown in museums. I believe they have over 9 different museums, and a lot of the artifacts and remains just are not seen by the public.
They're kept in vaults deep underground, as if I can remember correctly. A lot of stuff hasn't even seen the light of day since they discovered it and took it to the Smithsonian. Dan Brown writes about that. That's embarrassingly enough, that is how I come across the Smithsonian, is through one of his books when they were talking about the vast archive that they would have of things that they've managed to find and even confiscate in some circumstances, and has never seen the light of day again. Interesting
That's very
indeed.
true. That's very true. And also, I heard the Vatican has vast underground vaults with a lot of ancient history underneath the Vatican.
I think there's even areas where the Pope can't even go to in the Vatican, or things that he can't even look at himself. And I'd like to know, who is it that has higher authority and clearance than the head of the Catholic Church, I suppose. It boggles the mind, and it can go down so many different rabbit holes. We don't even have the time to do that. I should that would be a couple of different episodes,
A-
I would imagine. But
Absolutely.
I understand that your interest in this stems from your early childhood. What were the chain events that has led to your research today?
Well, Chris, I've always had a fascination with things like ancient civilizations, things like UFOs, paranormal phenomenon from a young age. And back in the 80s, there was a TV program that was very popular. It was called In Search of, and it was hosted by Leonard Nimoy.
The great Leonard
And
Nimoy, yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I've seen snippets of it, like YouTube's algorithm seems to know me quite well, and it'll throw up these random things now and again. And if I can
Yeah.
remember some of the later episodes, they had his sort of his Hollywood doppelganger who played Mr. Spock in the latest Star Trek movies. Zachary Quinto, is that correct? Is that his name? I think some of the later
Um,
episodes had him, maybe.
yeah, Leonard Nimoy was the host of that show when I watched it, and that really inspired me, really piqued my curiosity. And as a young boy, I picked up a book on giants, and it was by David Larkin. And it was a beautifully illustrated book, and it had myths and legends of giants, throughout the world. And I remember at the very beginning of that book, it did reference the Genesis 6 account of giants mentioned in the Bible. And it said, there were giants in the earth in those days and thereafter, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore them children, and they became mighty men, men of renown. And that little Bible verse really kind of stuck in my head, and I didn't end up investigating more into the giants until uh, much later in my life. Probably 8 or 9 years ago is when I really got interested into researching the giants. I heard a presentation by Jim Vieira, who's done a lot of research into giants and giant skeleton discoveries. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not.
Personally, I'm not, but I'm
Okay.
very well aware that some of our listeners and even some of our team members would definitely know who that is.
Right. Yeah, and it was after watching a presentation that he had done, and he was referencing a lot of these old accounts, newspaper articles on giant skeleton discoveries. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. And so my interest got piqued, and I started looking online, and I started compiling a folder, electronic folder of giant discoveries. And I was just amazed at what I was coming across. And one of the stories that really stuck out in my mind was the Lovelock Cave discovery, which is kind of the central story of my book. There's a lot of other subjects as well, but as far as giants, I kind of focus on that discovery because there was so much evidence. And basically, Lovelock Cave is in a state called Nevada in the United States, and it's in an area called the Lovelock area. And there's a Native American tribe in that area called the Northern Paiute. And they've had throughout their oral traditions tales of these giants with red hair. And they called them the Satika, or they called them people eaters because they were cannibals. And this tribe of red haired giants attacked neighboring tribes, and they murdered the other tribe members and ate them. They were not a nice tribe. They were large in stature, and they were powerful. They had red hair that they would adorn with bones. They were not a nice tribe. And finally, the Northern Paiute banded together with other tribes, and they waged war against these giants, which lasted about 3 years. And it culminated in them uh, rounding up the last of the red-haired giants and cornering them in Lovelock Cave. And they threw brush in front of the cave and shot flaming arrows and burnt the giants to death. Now, some of the Paiutes believe that not all the giants were killed. There were some that escaped.
I would imagine the ones that escaped, because as far as like with my limited knowledge of giants and what have you, I do understand that it's not. These cases don't seem to be localized entirely within the state of Nevada. I mean, we've heard things like this around the world before, where there's been giants. So I would well believe that that probably wasn't the end of the giants. Of some will have escaped, especially if they had means of transport to get around the world at that time. Which again,
You're absolutely correct.
relate
Yes, they
into
were.
biblical
There's
stuff as well.
reports of giants throughout all cultures. Just about every culture has some mention of giants in their history.
I mean, there certainly is. I mean, in Northern Ireland, or I guess the island of Ireland, there's the story of Finn McCool, which is a
Yes.
red-headed giant who, for listeners who don't know, long story short, he had a bone to pick with a Scottish giant. And Scottish giant come over the causeway from Scotland into Northern Ireland, which would be up and round in the Coleraine area. And Finn McCool had disguised himself as his baby son in a crib. And the Scottish giant had said, well, if this is the size of the baby, what size must his father be? And then he went back over Scotland, ripping up the causeway as he went across the Irish Sea. So
Wow.
that is the story behind that. We were taught that in school, and apparently Finn McCool's burial place is up in the Mourne Mountains. You can see his the features in the top of the mountain to say, yeah, that's it, that's where he was buried. Which, if he was that size, he was definitely gigantic. We're talking maybe
Yeah.
miles long. you know.
Yeah.
But
What a fascinating story. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I think I did actually I think that story was mentioned in the book that I purchased when I was a kid. In that book on giants, they had the story, and I remember one other piece in there that Finn McCool actually bit the finger off of the other giant. I think it
Yes, I
mentioned it.
think I remember that because whenever he
Yeah.
was poking at the child in the crib, or what he perceived to be the child in the crib, bit his finger off. That's a lot of
Yes.
childhood memories coming back from hearing that in
I
school.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, getting back to the red-haired giants in the Lovelock Cave, after the giants were killed, it wasn't until 1911 there were two guano miners, and guano is basically bat dung, who were mining this guano out of Lovelock Cave, and they discovered these giant skeletons and thousands of artifacts. And one of the discoverers, his name was John Reed, and this is quite interesting because he knew about the history of Lovelock Cave, and he knew about the red-haired giants because he was friends with a Native American man by the name of Natchez, who was son of Chief Winnemucca, which was a chief in that area of prominence. And when he was 15 years old, John Reed was on a recovery mission to retrieve horses that escaped his parents' ranch. And him and some of his friends, Natchez being one of them, went with him to collect these horses, to round these horses up. And they ended up camping outside of Lovelock Cave. And it was at that time when John Reed was 15 that Natchez kind of told him the story about the red-haired giants and how they were cannibals and how they attacked the other tribes and how eventually they were destroyed. He even took him to the entrance of the cave and pointed out there were still um, arrowheads, there were still projectile points that you could see that were embedded in the rock at the entrance, where it looks like there was arrows fired into that cave entrance. And of course, John being 15 years old, and he was quite adventurous, he wanted to immediately go in the cave and explore it and find these remains of the red-haired giants. But Natchez discouraged him and said, this cave is cursed. These people were evil, and he discouraged him from not going in the cave. But he couldn't convince the adventurous 15-year-old John Reed to not go in. And so the next day, um, his friends accompanied him to the entrance of the cave, and he lit up a torch and went inside to explore. And of course, he didn't find anything at that time, just piles of bat dung. But it's ironic that years later, as an adult, he would come full circle and go back to that cave and actually make the discoveries of these giant skeletons and artifacts.
It's certainly not unique to that part of the world. I mean, I've been hearing giant bones discovered even in the Far East, in around like
Yes.
China and the Vietnam regions. I've heard of that before. Maybe even India. I don't know. I'm just pushing the boat out there. I mean, anything that seems to happen like that, India usually is a place for it, and even along the River Euphrates in the Middle East. Um,
Absolutely.
Really, it is a fascinating subject, and again, I hold my hands up. I mean, I'm embarrassingly not up to speed when it comes to the gigantic, the giant side. But when it comes to like ancient mysteries and ufology, that is where my strong point, is. So, although the case of giants isn't my strong point when it comes to like ancient mysteries and ufology, I'm aware that the red hair is a very common theme. Why is this? And did all giants at the time have red hair?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And in some of the accounts, particularly with the Lovelock Cave, it was definitely mentioned throughout the Paiute oral tradition that they had distinct red hair. Other accounts of giants that I came across didn't indicate that a lot of them had red hair, but this particular tribe had red hair. And kind of the interesting thing about this, Chris, is after that discovery in 1911, archaeologists were immediately called in to excavate the cave, and they found over 10,000 artifacts and a number of giant skeletons that came out of that cave, and some of them actually still had the long red hair attached to the skulls. And what was interesting is that some of the artifacts were distributed to several different museums, but the skeletons disappeared. Like in many cases I had mentioned, they just simply they're taken out of the public view. However, apparently some of the skulls ended up in a small museum called Humboldt Museum, not too far from that area where they were discovered. And what was interesting is these skulls were kept in the basement. They weren't put on public display. So if you wanted to see the skulls, you actually had to ask the curator, and they would take you down into the basement to actually view the skulls. Now, those skulls were down in that basement until probably the mid 2000s, and they were finally removed from the museum. I actually contacted the museum. I wanted to go view the skulls myself, and they said they're no longer here. We had to give them back to the Native American tribes. Now, in the 1990s, there was a law in the United States that was passed called the Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act, which means that if any, skeletal remains were found that were believed to be of Native American origin, they had to go back to that particular tribe if it can be determined, where, which tribe they belong to. So the museum told me, no, we don't have these skulls anymore. And however, I did get my hands on some photographs from a researcher named Don Monroe that took photos of some of these giant skulls about 40 or 50 years ago. And there's one I have a picture of in the book. It's a massive skull. It's huge, and it has on the upper row of teeth what looks like a double row of teeth. And I came across many accounts of giant skeleton discoveries where they said they had a double row of teeth, which was interesting because you go back and there's a reference in the Bible of when David and his mighty men were fighting some of these Nephilim, these giants. There's one particularly mentioned that has a double row of teeth and 6 digits on each hand and each foot. So I thought it was interesting that that picture of the skull that I was able to obtain from the Lovelock Cave, in the upper row of teeth, it looked like it had a double set of teeth.
The way you said that it was in that small museum, the skulls were,
Yes.
up until the late or mid sort of noughties. And you were talking about it in past tense, obviously, before they were taken away. Did you get to see those skulls with your own eyes before they were removed?
Unfortunately, I did not get to see the skulls with my own eyes. However, I did see some of the artifacts that came out of the cave. And there was one artifact that I have pictured in my book. It's a pestle, like a hammering stone that was found right outside of Lovelock Cave, and it is massive. It is way, way bigger than your average pestle. It's probably 35 to 45 pounds and much, much larger than what is commonly used. And I actually had a dialogue with an anthropologist in that area, um, from the Nevada State Museum. And I had a dialogue with him. His last name was Hattori, Gene Hattori, and very nice man. And so I found some information on him on YouTube because he talked about the red-haired giants. And my impression of him is that he definitely believes the redhead giants actually existed. However, he wouldn't go into any kind of details when I started asking him more questions about it. He he kind of stopped communicating with me, and I don't know the reason that is, although I can speculate on why. He also sent me a picture of a sandal fragment that came out of that cave that would be the equivalent shoe size of a 29 here in the United States, which is bigger than any shoe size of any basketball player on record that actually came out of the cave. So I did not see the skulls firsthand, unfortunately, but I did see some of the overly large artifacts that came out of that cave.
It is food for thought because whenever I was in Nevada, um,
Mhm.
I never even knew that place existed, to be fair, in Lovelock. But whenever I went over, one of my, she used to be a spiritual mentor of mine. She told me, look out for the tall people in Nevada. She says, like, they'll be Nordic in appearance and they're probably extraterrestrial. But I never really was thinking about the giant bit at the time. But again, you were talking about the red hair element there.
Mhm.
And the reason I was sort of talking, or thinking if there was a connection between all the giants and red hair years ago is because I read research somewhere else. I can't remember who was sort of researching this offhand, but if I can remember, I'll stick it in the show notes, where the rulers of that time, whether it be the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, etc., a lot of their rulers had red hair, which was unpopular at the time. Would the giants that you're speaking about now, would they have been in a position of kingship or rulership over the people back then?
For this particular area, as far as Lovelock Cave, I'm not sure as far as being rulers. But in my investigations of giants just throughout the world, I mean, if we go back to the ancient Sumerian civilization, and you start to talk about the Anunnaki, and in the depictions of the Anunnaki, they were very tall. You can see these ancient pictures of them on the there's writings on the clay tablets, and
Yeah.
there's pictures that they're sitting on a throne, and you can see that their subject is standing before them, and just the Anunnaki sitting on the throne is already taller than their subject, and they're in a seated position. So it would look like, if you take it literally, if you these were giants.
I would say so as well, because even in some of the depictions between um, the common person, let's say for argument's sake, and kings and queens of Egypt, they weren't overly often depicted to be bigger than their subjects. It was the gods or these giant people that definitely were, and I would assume that if they were on the throne at the time, they probably were gods to them anyway, especially if they're that bloody tall. But it appears, from what we're talking about anyway, in the very least, that there's an indication of a connection between these giants and the ancient aliens theory. Like the Anunnaki were said to be giants of the Sumerian records, like you said. Would that be the case all over the world?
Yes, I mean, I really think that's a valid theory, and in fact, there's two theories that I examine in my book, and one of them is that are these giants are they of extraterrestrial origin, or are they just another branch of our species? And I explore, each one of those theories. And as far as the extraterrestrial theory is concerned, if you go back to the biblical tales of the giants, in Genesis 6 that I had mentioned, they were referred to as the sons of God. And so I was really curious. I'm like, wow, that's really weird. Who were the sons of God? And so I started looking and examining in the biblical text who were the sons of God. And I believe they were the angels. They were the fallen angels. And it actually references it in the Bible. There's a section in there where it talks about how Satan and the sons of God show themselves before the Lord. And there's also another passage in the Bible that says, basically, the sons of God shouted for joy at the foundations of the earth when it was being created. Well, obviously, that was long before humankind was created. So they had to be some celestial beings. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the book of Enoch. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm familiar
That
with it. Yeah, I was
text?
just about to ask ask about that. Yeah.
Yes, and so the book of Enoch was left out of the canonized version of the Bible, but that goes very in depth of to who the watchers were and who the Nephilim were. And basically in that story it says that there was a group of watchers, which are angels, to a group of 200. Basically they made a pact with each other because they found the women of the earth fair, and they came to the earth and at an area in Syria called Mount Hermon, which means the Mount of Desolation. And they chose them wives from amongst the humans, and they impregnated them, and they bore children, and those children were called the Nephilim. And Nephilim is a Proto-Hebrew word meaning fallen ones, and their offspring became these giants. And not only did the Watchers impregnate the women of the earth, but they gave us forbidden knowledge. They taught us these sciences that perhaps God didn't think we were ready for, and they jumped the gun. And so they taught us about astronomy, astrology, the arts of war, herbalism, all these different arts and sciences that they taught our ancestors. And the Nephilim, they were giants, and they started tearing up the earth, destroying everything, destroying humans, destroying themselves. They were corrupting. In the book of Enoch, it says they were corrupting plant and animal life. And I thought, wow, that sounds really odd. And to me, in fact, it sounds almost like genetic engineering. When the more I thought about it, and so they were destroying everything, and that's why God brought the great flood to wipe the giants out. And it killed most of the giants, but it didn't kill them all. There were remnants of the giants that lived, and there was a bloodline that continued on after the great flood.
That is going down into the realms of perhaps somewhere where Dan Brown would love to write about, the sort of godly and royal bloodlines. It's interesting.
Yes.
It really is interesting stuff. That because the Book of Enoch, I mean, I know it. Everyone who studies ufology knows, was deliberately omitted from our Bible. The Catholic Church omitted it, and then of course the Bibles at the Protestant churches is based on the Catholic Bible. That was censored by the Catholic Church. But I can't remember whether the Hebrews actually have it in their Torah or not. But I certainly know that I think it's the Coptic Ethiopians, I think, have it in
They
their
do.
Bible. Yeah.
Yes, that is
And
correct. That is
interestingly enough,
correct.
it's the Ethiopians that are supposed to be guarding
The Ark.
the Ark. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? Very fascinating. So when getting back to your question, Chris, about extraterrestrial, if you look at it, like the ancient people said, oh, these watchers came down, and birthed the Nephilim. But if you think of watcher or angel, they are not from the earth. They're not from the earth. So what technically does that make them?
that makes them extraterrestrial. Yeah.
It makes them extraterrestrial. So I explore that tract in my book, which is very fascinating. And then the other piece that I look at also is, are these giants just another branch, another species, another hominid species that is just we don't know about, that we just discovered? And then I start to get into the discovery of in the 2010 discovery in Siberia, in Denisova cave, of a new species of human called the Denisovans. Are you familiar with them?
Do you know, I think I heard about that, yeah, probably in around that time, but I didn't really follow through with the research on that. But I thought it was quite interesting when I did hear, because it was almost perfectly preserved, if I can remember.
Yes, so this happened in 2010 in a cave in Siberia. Archaeologists found some bone fragments, and one of them that they found was a tooth, and it was so large that originally the archaeologists that found it thought it was a cave bear. It was so huge. They also found like a green stone bracelet with little holes drilled in it, like 8 millimeter, like very, very tiny. And whoever created this bracelet, they had an advanced level of technology. And the finger bone and the other artifact, and I think there was some other bone fragments that were found, go back at least 40,000 years ago. And so once they started doing DNA testing on the tooth, they discovered that this is another ancestor of ours. And they named the ancestor Denisovan, and they believe that these Denisovans lived all the way back from about 300,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago. And recently, there was a Denisovan skull found in China. They call it a Homo longi, or dragon man skull. A Chinese construction worker, found this skull. This was probably back in the 20s or 30s, I believed, and he hid the skull in a well. And so it was on his deathbed that he revealed to his children that he had found the skull, and told them where it was. And so his children actually went back and recovered the skull, and it's a massive, massive skull, and it's very different. It's not Neanderthal, and it's very massive. In fact, I have a replica of it that I purchased from the UK, of its exact dimensions, a casting of it. And so then I get into the theory. Well, okay, these Denisovans, this is a new branch of our species, and they were interbreeding with the Neanderthals and with our ancestors. And obviously, we know Neanderthals were interbreeding with our ancestors. And actually, most of us have some Neanderthal DNA in us.
40,000 years ago. So again, I've said it before in a couple of podcasts beforehand. In the wise words of Graham Hancock, stuff just keeps getting older. And it really does when it comes to these important archaeological discoveries. But I feel that a lot of it is suppressed. Obviously, for whatever obvious reasons. Maybe they think that humanity isn't ready for that sort of knowledge, or maybe they don't like to be seen to be wrong on the matter.
You're
But a lot
you're
of it
you're
is.
so correct. You're so correct, and I absolutely love Graham Hancock. He's one of my heroes, and I remember one of his quotes, like, "The farther back we look at our history, the more it appears like a fairy tale of like what we've been told." And you are correct, Chris. I believe that knowledge is controlled. It's controlled. So if you can control the past, you can control the future. And if you control the present, you control the past. So it's all about a level of control. And I believe too, it comes down to knowledge filtration. So, what's taught in the universities and, by to the archaeologist, anthropologist is this is the way things are. And if you find anything that contradicts that, it can't be true. It's got to be faked or planted, or if it just doesn't fit in, just, sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, I was just going to say that because I hear about that a lot, even with discoveries that people are making now, not just for um, you know, giant bones and whatever. We're talking like space stuff here, and
Hmm.
like ancient knowledge and what have you is suppressed so much. Um, like people who used to be, I mean, I know of some people, don't know them personally, but I know of some people who were at one point would have been labeled mainstream scientists, but once they
Hmm.
started to go against the current, against the narrative, funding was cut for them, and they had to go completely independent and rely totally on donations from people who supported their work, which I believe the money dries up very quickly when it comes to that, sort of tricky situation that you find yourself in when you go against the narrative. It's
That's so true. It's so true. And we can see it now with the whole COVID narrative and how some doctors came out and said, well, we have differing views from the mainstream. And they were ostracized and censored. And, their voices they tried to silence them.
Yeah, and anyone who doesn't even believe that, I would recommend that you use an alternative search engine. To be fair, because Google even openly admitted that they were going to be uh, alter their algorithms. So anything that was critical of the narrative at the time when it come to COVID and that sort of stuff would come way, way, way down
Hmm.
in their search returns whenever somebody was searching for it. Same happens with conspiracy theories and even a lot of the alien stuff now. For the last
Yeah.
probably about 5 years, etc., maybe longer, has been dampened by Google in their
Yes,
algorithms.
there's a lot of the censorship and cover-ups. And in fact, in my book pertaining to giants, I talk about there was a number of cases where the Smithsonian actually tried to purchase some of these giant remains that were found. So it's funny because here you have an institution that totally says, "Oh, this is just myth and legend," and yet there was an incident called the San Diego Giant that happened. I believe this was in the either late 1800s or yeah, I think it was late 1800s. A giant mummy was found, almost 9 feet tall, in San Diego. Some miners found it, and the Smithsonian was very interested in it. They sent out some of their agents to procure it. They paid the equivalent of $14,000 to purchase a giant, and they bought it. And then they later came out and said, "Oh, we tested it, and the skin was made of gelatin. It was a fake." And no one ever saw it again. So I just thought it was very interesting for an institution that didn't even believe in anything like that would actually send their agents and pay the equivalent of $14,000 to purchase that, and
Yeah,
then just
even
simply
even if they
say,
weren't
"Oh, it
going
was
to
fake."
put it for show in the Smithsonian, even after they did test it, could donate it to Ripley's Believe It or Not if it was fake, but
Good
it does,
point.
yeah,
That's a very good
it
point.
does make
Yeah.
us
So
think
what
that
happened
they
to
are
that?
hiding something.
Yeah, what happened? And there was another article that I reference in the book of a man in Arizona on his farm. He found a giant skeleton, and the Smithsonian dispatched several of their agents to take a look at the skeleton. They actually photographed the skeleton, and they wanted to buy it from this man. And in fact, the article says man refuses to sell giant skeleton to Smithsonian. He's like, "No, I'm not gonna sell this because it's gonna disappear." Now, I don't know whatever happened to that particular skeleton, but it didn't end up in the Smithsonian's hands, and they documented it. They took pictures of it. In the article, it said that the skull was beyond human comprehension as far as the physical size of it.
It sort of makes me wonder what happened to the man who discovered it. Did he disappear or did he live a long and healthy life? I don't know.
It
When you have these
that
agents behind these powerful organizations, you never know what might happen to you. One of the famous giants, actually, uh, according to biblical accounts, is Goliath.
Yes.
And obviously he's famous, especially in the Western world and what have you, because that's what we were taught in schools when it comes to religious education. We know from records that mention him, and he wasn't just mentioned in the Bible. I think he was mentioned in other writings as well from other religions. But we know
Yes.
that he was about 6'9" by modern measurements. Was this the sort of height you'd expect from your research, or did they vary in height, like the 9 foot tall one you just spoke about?
Yes, they did vary in height. They did vary in height. Most of the accounts that I saw, I came across between almost 8 feet and 8 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet. But I will tell you, I came across some ones that claimed much larger. And there was a discovery in Pennsylvania of an 18-foot giant, and it was
Flipping
found
hell.
in a burial mound. It looked like it was a Native American mound. And according to the article, it said there was a giant. It was 18 feet tall, and it had armor like uh, that type of armor found in the ancient city of Nineveh. And it had a sword that was probably 9 feet long. And in the article, it said it had a double row of teeth. It references the double row of teeth. And of course, the Smithsonian was referenced, that they would come in and examine the skeleton, and then it would be put on display. And then after that, you hear nothing.
I mean, 18 foot, that is ridiculously tall.
It is
Taller than a lot
ridiculously
of the
tall.
buildings that people live in these days. Can't even fathom that. I can't even find, I'm looking out the window, it's too dark to look out. I can't even find a reference point to what 18 foot would be out there. Uh,
Right. It's hard.
Absolutely
Yeah, it's
crazy.
hard to imagine. Hard to imagine.
It
But
is.
yeah, most of the accounts that I found, they were probably in the closer to upper, 7 feet, close to 8 feet, 9 feet, height. But there were some that were allegedly much taller.
It wouldn't surprise me because it just seems to get bigger and bigger, like scarily big. I'm even imagining sort of Jack and the Beanstalk, the height that the giant was supposed to be in it. There's no reason why it couldn't be as tall as the giant that featured in it, which was the main protagonist. Here is a question for you, actually, now that I think about it.
Yes.
Where did the giants go, the ones that survived, and how long ago did they disappear? And what made them disappear, I suppose, as well?
Those are very good questions that I really don't know if anyone has a definite answer for any of those. We can just speculate. Throughout Native American culture, I kind of focus as far as giants go on the North American continent, and just about every Native American tribe has references to giants. And in fact, in Utah, there's pictographs of these giant figures. You'll see them next to you'll see a small figure, and you'll see these giant beings next to them. And what's ironic too is you'll notice on their hands that they have 6 digits, not five, they have six. And again, that's referenced in the Bible of the giant with the 6 digits on each hand and the double row of teeth. So I believe that these giants probably died out, a long time ago, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Who knows? Thousands of years ago. It's speculation, but some people believe, Chris, that there are bloodlines that still are connected to these giants, these Nephilim, these fallen ones.
And if I was a betting man, I would say that the bloodline theory would perhaps be our rulers of today. Would I be right?
You'd be right. And in fact, in my book, I talk about in the initial discovery at Lovelock Cave, one of the archaeologists even writes this in his documentation, that the largest of the mummies disappeared, and it was given to a fraternal lodge to be boiled and used for initiation purposes. And that really blew my mind. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. And so I did a little research and contacted the historical society in that area, and asked them, if they knew of what fraternal societies were in that area at that particular time in the early 1900s. And they said the Knights of Pythias, and they said that the Freemasons were there. And I actually did a little research on the Knights Pythias to see if they used any human remains in their initiation rites. And I did find evidence that in one of their initiation rites, they used a skull and crossbones. And I also looked at the Freemasons, and actually, I found a number of accounts, some of them fairly recent, particularly in Australia, where human remains were actually found at some of these Masonic lodges, that they would use these human bones in their initiation rites. So I did find evidence to back up that human remains were used in some of these fraternal societies. But not only that, I reached out to the Freemasons, to that lodge in that area, and of Winnemucca, and I got a response back. And of course, well, no, we didn't. We never received any skeletal remains from Lovelock Cave, and nor any other fraternal societies in this area ever received any of those remains. It was just kind of a short response. But I started kind of looking into, like, well, is there a connection, like, between the legends of the giants and Freemasonry and some of these other secret societies like the Rosicrucians? And there is. You can actually trace it back, that they do believe in some of the ancient mysteries that they claim that they inherited, like, for example, Freemasonry, going back to the ancient Egyptian mysteries, that the Masons do in their history believe that there were giants, and they called them the El Shaddai in Egypt, and they said that they were the ones that built the Great Pyramids, and that within those pyramids were knowledge that was very important to humankind.
Jordan makes me think, would the giants have built the pyramids as well? That's interesting. Like, I would never actually have put those dots together. Do you think that the Freemasons and what was the other lodge? Sorry, that you.
There was, well, there are Freemasons, also Rosicrucians, and then there was another Knights of Pythias, which is
Knights of
another
Pythias. That's
fraternal
it.
organization.
Do you think the
Yeah.
Knights of Pythias are a like a higher degree in Freemasonry, or is it a standalone sort of fraternal organization?
I think it's a kind of a standalone. I think it's more of an offshoot. Um, Freemasonry, however, what I know of it, what I've researched of it, I do believe that they um, have ancient knowledge that they've preserved. And I'm not saying that what they claim is accurate, but I do believe it's a knowledge that's been preserved, at least going back to the ancient Egyptian mystery schools. And you can also tie in orders like the Knights Templar and the Cathars and these different orders that have preserved this knowledge throughout the centuries, that these societies claim that they hold. And I believe that knowledge was actually antediluvian knowledge, that this knowledge was pre-flood knowledge. Pre-flood, I believe it comes from these sacred sciences that the Nephilim, or that the Watchers came down and they taught mankind, and so they presented those to humankind, and those were preserved, and they survived after the flood. And so then this knowledge would be regained after the destruction of the earth.
Sort of makes you wonder, what other secrets could they be hiding that would not only be interesting to find out, but certainly should benefit mankind as a whole to be aware of this, I guess, at the minute, forbidden knowledge, because they're not letting us know what that stuff is for whatever reason it may be. But I've heard from other researchers that ancient civilizations knew of portals to other realms, to our other worlds, which were activated by the vibration of certain tones of sound. I mean, there's a place in the Republic of Ireland, I can't remember the name or location of it, but my friend Barry Fitzgerald, he has researched it, and I need to ask him about it, where a man had entered this tunnel. You have to crawl into it. It goes under a main road, and you go so far down, I think you have to crouch down, and then there's a big chamber, and he blew I believe it was like an old style horn or something like that, and produced a sound, and a tall being had manifested in front of him. Has stuff like
Incredible.
this come up with you in your research before? And either way, if it hasn't, do you think the ancient gods or giants made use of these portals?
Absolutely. Yes, I do believe that. In fact, in the Native American tribe, the Anasazi, they actually, in their tradition, have a story that their medicine men were taught black magic, and they were experimenting with black magic, and they opened up a portal, and a reptilian being came out of the portal and started corrupting their civilization, started teaching their shamans, their medicine man, the dark magic. And because they were involved in that, it degraded their civilization. It led to cannibalism, and apparently other portals were opened up. And guess what came out of the portals? Giants. And the giants started destroying everything. And in fact, the Anasazi tribes, they had to flee their area. They made these beautiful constructions, these pueblos is what they were called, and these were up on cliffs, and they were amazing structures for their time. And they left supplies, they left food, they left weaponry. And archaeologists at first discovered that site. They couldn't figure out, like, well, what happened? It looks like all these valuable things were left. What caused these people to flee? And the conventional explanation would be, oh, it was climate change, that type of thing, and so the people had to migrate. But the elders of the Anasazi, they will tell you it was because their ancestors opened up these portals, and these giants came out and were attacking them, and they literally had to flee for their lives.
Just seems it's not in your part of the world, or not just our part of the world either, but it does seem to be all over the place. I believe Barry said in one of his books, I even think he told me when he was talking about it, that one of the indications that a portal is nearby is the sort of ancient spiral. You see a lot of it in Celtic myth, and it's
Yes.
found all over the world, and that usually indicates a portal. But I digress, because we have overrun actually, and I knew this would happen. I knew this would happen. I would get so engrossed. It literally did. Honestly, I don't kid you. It felt like 10 minutes, and it's now
It
clocked at
felt like 10
50.
minutes to me too. It
Yeah, it's
felt like
clocked
we
at
were
50.
in
But
a
I'm not going to end it
portal
there just yet. I'm not going to
yes.
end it there just yet because, obviously, with your book, you do have, as the title indicates, more examples of other mysteries in your book. Can you give us a couple of examples of other mysteries you include in your book?
Yes, thank you. I talk about the little people. So in my research and discovery of giant skeletons, I started coming across accounts of little people discovery, little skeletons in North America, particularly in the area of Tennessee. And there's a lot of Native American oral tradition of these little people. In fact, throughout North America, they talk about giants, they talk about little people. And so I talk about the little people and articles I present of skeletal remains in North America. And of course, they disappear. Smithsonian shows up, they disappear. And I tie that in with the discovery of the early 2000s and 2003 of the Flores Hobbit of Indonesia. Are you familiar with that discovery?
I don't think I am, no.
Okay, it's on the Isle of Flores in Indonesia in 2003 in Liang Bao Cave. They discovered the remains of a little person, which was a little taller, not much taller than 3 feet, and they dubbed that skeleton the Flores Hobbit. And so they started doing all these testings because they noticed that they examined the teeth and that it was like an adult. It wasn't like a child. It was an adult, a fully developed adult. And so archaeologists were saying, oh, it's probably microcephaly. It's probably some disease that made, this being, short. And none of the tests proved that it had anything like any kind of genetic disorder or disease. And then they started finding more bone fragments. They started finding more tools. These beings were intelligent. They knew how to make fire. They knew how to make weapons. They hunted for their food. In fact, they think that they hunted Komodo dragons, which lived in that area. And so this is archaeological proof that there were little people that once existed on this earth, and they were intelligent. In fact, in parts of Indonesia, a lot of the tribes people will say that they still exist, and they call them the Ibu Gogu, which means the grandmother that eats everything, because they have these ravenous appetites. And there's many legends and stories of people actually encountering and seeing these little people in different parts of Indonesia in very remote areas. So I get into the little people. I also talk about the Nazca mummies. Are you familiar with that, Chris?
Yes, I know a couple of people who were involved with research into that. Yeah.
You're very fascinating. And so I get into the Nazca mummies and the whole um, concept of cranial deformation. Why were people, throughout the world elongating their skulls? Why were they doing that? Was it just because they wanted to look different, or because perhaps they encountered beings that had heads shaped like that were very advanced, that they looked at as like gods? And so, the greatest form of flattery is imitation. And so they wanted to make themselves look like these gods. And so they artificially elongated their skulls. But what's interesting, and I talk about in my book, in Peru, in the Ica region, there are these elongated skulls that are not artificially formed. That you can look at them. Medical doctors have looked at these things and said, this is not cradle boarded. This is natural. And if you look on the back of the head, like uh, mo- uh, we have what's called a sagittal suture, which is on the back of our skull, and it looks kind of like the shape of a bow with a notched arrow. Well, some of these skulls in Paracas, they don't even have that. They don't even have that sagittal suture. So even if they were artificially elongated, they should have that suture in their skull, and they don't. So they're different. They're different from us.
Another thing, actually, is whenever they find these elongated skulls that have been purposefully done to other humans, the I think is it the volume of bone density. It obviously it flattens out because it has to, it's the same volume of bone density, but it becomes thinner, obviously, because it has to. Your body only grows a certain amount of bone, so it has a greater surface area to cover, whereas one that hasn't been done to humans usually has a thicker bone density as well, which you would expect with a bigger skull in order to protect it properly and not sort of thin it out a bit.
Absolutely. And if we were talking about like ancient Egypt and that type of thing with extraterrestrial intervention. If you look at some of like Akhenaten, for example, and you see the depictions of him, what does his head look
It's
like?
the elongated skull, yeah.
Absolutely.
Listen, I could talk forever about this, and I could listen even longer again about this sort of stuff.
Yes,
I mean, we could even go down the route of the little people, and that would definitely be another episode when it comes to that.
absolutely. If you ever want to have me back, I would love to do a show on the little people.
I would definitely 100% have you back because, again, if I don't physically put a stop now, it will keep on
Right.
going. I know it
Yeah.
will, and there's so many rabbit holes with every topic. Whether it was in episode 3 with a regressive hypnotherapist or a conspiracy theorist in the episode just gone, it's there's so many rabbit holes to all sorts of disciplines when it comes to this sort of
Yes.
stuff. But first and foremost, and well, I suppose not first and foremost, but finally, where can our listeners find you, and how can they get their hands on your book?
Okay, thank you very much. My website's at theancientgiants.com, and you can purchase my book at bookbaby.com, and there's a bookshop on there. And the title of my book is The Red-Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave and Other Ancient Mysteries. You can also find my book on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. Since I am a self-published author, if you are interested in purchasing my book, I would really appreciate it if you do go through BookBaby, because they are really supportive of self-published authors. But again, you could also find that on Amazon and Barnes and Noble as well.
I will be sure to put the website and the Book Baby link into the show notes so people can find it at ease and get your book and read it at their leisure. Floyd Wills, thank you very much for coming onto the show all the way from Vancouver in the United States. Thank you for joining this episode. It was a fantastic episode, and please keep us up to date with your research as it progresses, and hopefully we'll get you back into another episode.
It's been a real pleasure, Chris. Thank you to you and your audience for having me on.
No, thank you indeed. And that wraps it up for this one. We'll go into the Society events and the upcoming Celestial events. Thank you very much indeed. Floyd Wills there talking about his book and the idea of ancient giants. Now, a good researcher and author opens minds and encourages thinking on their subject, and that's exactly what has happened here. Do you know, I've never really paid much attention to the ancient giant theory. I've been aware of it, but I've never really researched it. But, you know, this has inspired me to brush up on my knowledge and research here, and especially when it interlocks with the ancient aliens theory. And what better place to start than his book? After we finished the interview, we spoke as I always do, and he was so kind to send me a copy of his book for free, might I add, and have it signed. So next month, coming up in April, I have a month-long holiday booked. So I'm rather looking forward to that, and I know exactly what I will be reading and studying over that period. So Floyd, if you're listening to this, a massive thank you for that. I really do appreciate it, and I really can't wait to start reading that book and get to know a little bit more about the ancient giants theory. Now, let us take a look at the celestial events that are coming up for the week ahead. So, on the 28th, there is a close approach of the Moon and Mars. Now, it's not overly rare. You know, it happens a few times within our lifetimes, but I would imagine that if you haven't seen it before, now would be a good time to do it, because the Moon is quite dark. Speaking of the Moon, we have the Moon, I do apologise, on the 29th, is at its first quarter. And so it's getting good. It's not quite a full moon yet, so the light is still forgiving to do some star watching. And speaking of that, we've got Comet C 2019 Pan-STARRS passes its perihelion, which would be a good time to get a telescope out to see if you can see it. Speaking of telescopes, the dwarf planet 136472, Make, is at its opposition, which means that Earth is directly between the dwarf planet and the Sun, which makes it good for viewing, and it is visible in the northern hemisphere as well. I'm sure it'll be visible in the southern hemisphere at the same time, but get yourself out and take a look at it, get yourself a good telescope and see what you can see. And then finally, on the 31st, we have the conjunction of Venus and Uranus, and Mercury will be at its perihelion as well. If you are going to be taking a look at Venus in the mornings or Mercury when it's visible, do take care to use the proper equipment. Do not look directly at the sun. I know it's like me telling people not to be eating a packet of peanuts whenever they are allergic to peanuts, but gotta cover myself in some shape or form. And finally, we will talk a little bit about the upcoming watch night that we forgot to mention and talk about in the last episode. But not much to release at the minute. The date has yet to be set in stone. If, however, you are a team member or you attended our NIUFOS open day last month, then this will be open for you to come along to. As I said, the date is yet to be set in stone, but the only reason for that is because we're waiting for a majority of our team members to be available at that time. Happening in April, more than likely on the north coast of Northern Ireland. And it won't be an all-night thing, just because we don't need it to be. Every time we've been out, everything seems to have happened before 2 a.m. So what we used to do was be there from about 9 and stay there to about 6, which is a long stint for a lot of people, especially whenever they have to drive further distances. So it will probably be from whenever the sun sets up until about 2, half 2 in the morning. Come and go as you please. And that will be that. Listen, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Close Encounters podcast. It was an interesting one, I must say, and I must claim ignorance here because I really am not up to speed when it comes to the ancient giants theory. But, it's something for me to look into and brush up on for next time. Massive thank you to Floyd for talking to me. You've been listening to the Close Encounters podcast with me, Chris McMurray, and until next time, have a good week.